Right.
Can I mute?
You're not muted now. It's all good. It's all
Okay,
good.
I'm going to.
Go ahead. Welcome, everyone, to today's keynote speaker. We're really excited to hear from them today. I am going to have the privilege to introduce one of our INCORE ISCORE scholars, Edith Barton, who is going to introduce our keynote for today. So I will pass it over to her.
Hello, my name is Edith Barton. I am a sophomore majoring in entrepreneurship. It is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Novotny Lawrence. Dr. Novotny Lawrence earned his PhD in 2004 from the Theater and Film Department, now the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Kansas. He was previously an associate professor in radio, television, and digital media at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, where he taught courses such as media and society, film history and analysis, race and the media, and history of African American images in film. In 2018, he joined the faculty in the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication at Iowa State University, where he continues to instruct courses focusing on media, race, and representation. Dr. Lawrence's research centers on African American meditated experience in popular culture. He is the author of Blaxploitation films in the 1970s, Blackness and Genre, Routledge 2007, the editor of Documenting the Black Experience, McFarland 2014, and the co-editor of Beyond Blaxploitation, Wayne State University Press 2016. Dr. Lawrence has also published articles and books, chapters on the Jeffersons, the Twilight Zone, Dave Chappelle, and CSA, the Confederate States of America, my bad. Since 2012, Dr. Lawrence currently serves on the governing board of the Popular Culture Association, and he is a chair of the Race and Ethnicity area of the Film and History Conference. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Novotny Lawrence.
All right. Thank you, Edith, for the introduction. I really appreciate that. It's always very humbling to hear people say things about what you've accomplished in your career. And I just want to say that I appreciate that very much. And I'm just very fortunate and very blessed. I also want to thank Japana Kellogg for inviting me to participate in ISCORE. It's a conference that I heard a lot about. I hadn't gotten the opportunity to partake in it, but I have to say that I was very excited to hear from him and receive this invitation to deliver a keynote. And I want to thank Joelle Mitchell as well for all of her assistance along the way leading up to the event, because without her kind of keeping me on track and making sure that I was prepared, I don't know that I would be in the position to deliver this keynote today. So thank you all very much. And I'm so happy to be here. And I want to start just by talking a little bit about how I guess came to deliver this keynote, and then I'm going to go into my presentation a little bit. But I received the invitation to speak from Japana. And again, I was really excited, and I had a phone call with him and we spoke, and he explained to me that generally every year someone will lead the participants through their research during the ISCORE conference. And so, that sounded great to me because I'm committed fully to what I affectionately call the work, capital T, capital W. And I said, whenever I get these opportunities to step in and do the work, I want to take them. So we spoke, had a great conversation. It was fantastic to meet Japana. And then we got off the phone and kind of went our separate ways. And I started thinking about what it was that I wanted to talk with you all about today. And then a little time passed, and it dawned on me that I forgot to ask a pretty significant question. And that question is, what is it people usually say about their research, or what is it that they do when they guide the conference participants through their research during their keynote? And I kind of felt like that was an important question. So I said, I better reach out to Japana again. So I called him and we talked. And he said something that was really important that stood out to me. He said, first and foremost, he said, put yourself into it. And that was his tip. And it was good advice because on the one hand, I said, okay, well, I can do that. And on the other hand, it was challenging advice for me because if any of you in the room know me, you know that one of the things I hate more than anything is talking about myself. It's just something that I don't do very well. And when it comes to the work, I rarely make it about myself because I always say, this is not about me. It is about the work. But at the same time, it was good advice. And so where I decided that I wanted to begin today was simply by taking you all on a little journey about how it is that I came to participate or engage in doing the work using film and media. And this all started, I'm going to go back to my childhood, and it began with my love of television. Growing up, there was nothing I liked to do more than to get my desserts. And you have to understand that I grew up in a household where there was always something sweet on hand because my mom loved to bake. So there was going to be a pound cake or $1 million pie or pumpkin bars or some fruit cocktail concoction that she mixed up together that we never knew how she did it, but it was delicious. That was going to be in my house. And so me and my brothers and my parents, we would all get our desserts and we would go to our den and we would sit down and we would watch television together. Sometimes we watch classic shows, might be my mom's favorite show, which was I Love Lucy. We might watch Andy Griffith together, or we might watch more contemporary shows. And I'm coming up in the 70s and the 80s. And so we might look at something like Heart to Heart, or we might watch The Jeffersons. Now, you may have noticed that the name of my presentation today, and I'm going to put the PowerPoint up here in just a second, is Meditations on Blackness, Film and Media Representations. And I mentioned the title because at that time, when I was sitting in my den with my parents and my brothers, and we were watching all those TV shows, I didn't quite understand as a child that I was already starting to meditate on Blackness as presented in our film and our media, but I was. And that was because there was always something very special about seeing people who looked like us on television. We loved The Jeffersons because it was about a Black family. We absolutely used to get excited when we would see Black families on Family Feud, and we would run through the house telling each other, you got to come watch Family Feud. There's a Black family on there. And we were very excited for it. We were hungry for those images. And now, there are Black people on Family Feud all the time, but in the 80s, that just necessarily wasn't the case. So we were excited. And again, I was already hungry for images and meditating on Blackness. So not only then did I love television as a child, I also loved film. There was a point in time in my childhood where I also used to go to the movies every Saturday, and I would be whisked away into these worlds, watching movies like Chomps and Krull and any other title that was playing at the theater. It didn't matter. I just wanted to be in that theater, looking at that screen, eating my popcorn and having my snacks and just being taken away and dreaming like I was one of the characters in the films. So I always loved those movies, always loved television, but I never gave much thought to the fact that maybe I could do something in film and media for a living. Well, flash forward, I went to college, and when I first go to school, I'm going to be a business major. I'm thinking, well, that sounds good. My mom always talked about being a business major, and I said, sure, that's what I'm going to do. And then I took my first accounting class the first semester of college, and the professor got to hit me upside the head with ledgers and credits and debits. And I said, oh my goodness, no, I cannot do this. I am not going to be a business major. So unlike college students, because I know this never happens to students in college, I decided that I was going to change my major and I was going to focus on advertising. I met an adjunct professor there. His name was Russell Disberger, and he talked to me about the advertising industry. And I decided, I think I can make a living doing this. So I wanted to conceive of commercials, write jingles and slogans, do things like that. And this was when I was in community college out in Garden City, Kansas. So I decided that that's what I was going to do. And I left there after completing my 2 years, and I moved on to the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where I was a communications major with the desire to go into advertising. So that's how I was going to use that degree to break into that world. And while I was there, I became a walking cliche. And what I mean by that is I became a cliche because I took one class, and I feel like you hear people say this all the time, that changed the trajectory of my life. That class was called Silver Screen and the American Dream, and it was offered during the fall semester of my senior year of college. In that class, we met at this theater called the Tivoli, and they opened up the concession stand for us so we could get popcorn and milk duds and juicy fruits, and we would go to class on Tuesdays and we would watch films. And I'm talking classic films like The Gold Diggers of 1933, films like The Public Enemy, Sunset Boulevard, Chinatown, Rebel Without a Cause, all on the big screen, just as they were supposed to be seen. And then on Thursdays, we would reconvene in class in that theater again. And it was a collaborative effort. So there were 3 professors. There was one who was from the English department, another from the history department, and another from the communication studies department. And they would come in and they would analyze and critique these films. and they would talk about them from their various disciplines. And it was in that moment I said, oh my goodness, wow. Look at what film can do. Look at what it can tell us about society and our world. And I also started to learn that there's this line that perhaps we shouldn't say about film and media more broadly, and that is, it's just entertainment. Nothing could be farther from the truth. There's always more going on in film and media than just entertainment. After all, we are talking about multi-million-dollar industries. So we have to break out of this mode of saying things are just entertainment, because nothing could be farther from the truth. And so what I learned as I had this revelation that, oh my goodness, I can maybe have a career teaching and talking about film and media and using it to engage in the work of social equity, what I learned is that there was a whole history of African-American representation that I didn't know about. Even in that class that changed my life, many of the films did not prominently feature Black folks. So in this presentation today, I kind of want to take you a little bit on that journey and tell you what I learned once I started studying film and media more broadly. So I'm going to share my screen now and go ahead and start talking with you all about this presentation a little bit more specifically. So once I decided that I was going to start studying film and media and that I wanted to pursue my master's and later on my PhD, I said I want to focus on Black experiences. I want to meditate on Blackness. And so this presentation, I'm going to ask you all, in this presentation rather, I'm going to ask you all to meditate on Blackness with me for a while. One of the books, if you start studying Black film and media history, that you have to read is a book by a film historian named Donald Bogle. And the name of that book is called Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, An Interpretive History of Blacks in American Films. And again, this is the text. This is where you have to begin, because ultimately what this book tells you is that it delivers a history signifying that film has historically been an extension of United States racism. Now, this was a deeply disturbing revelation for me, given that I liked film so much when I was growing up. But when it came down to Black representation, I quickly learned that this also was engaged in depicting Blacks as second-class citizens and perpetuating and reinforcing the most egregious stereotypes that exist about Black folks in this country and in the world more broadly. And that was tough. And what Bogle does in this book is he gives us a framework, these caricatures through which we can view and understand film and what it was that the cinema was doing to the Black image. In particular, he starts off with this caricature called the Tom. And this character, and these are brief descriptions, they go in much more detail in the book. This Tom is a likable character, and they know their place, right? They're very loyal to whites. And here's an image of Bill Bojangles Robinson playing the devoted Tom alongside Shirley Temple. And it's a character that endears themselves to whites because they know their place. They're not uppity. They don't step out of line. They don't demand things like equity and inclusion. They know their place. You are second class and you should be happy in that position. The second character type that Bogle talks about is what is called the coon. And this is a lazy, unintelligent, unreliable character type. In films, these characters love eating watermelon. They'll do anything to avoid work, and they're just there for comic relief. They're to be laughed at. They tell us that Black is funny. It's not something that needs to be taken seriously. And in many ways, they're so childlike and lazy that if they had independence, there's no way they could take care of themselves. So in some ways, this character operates as a justification for slavery, for enslaving Black people. Here we have an image of an actor named Willie Best, who played a range of coons in any number of motion pictures. In addition to the coon, we also have what is called the mammy. This is one of the most popular caricatures that exist in cinema. And this character was sassy, overweight, bossy, overbearing, and loyal. She also is kind of like Tom in that she endears herself to white audiences, and therefore she becomes someone that's likable because she also knows her place. This is an image of perhaps one of the most beloved screen mammies in the history of cinema. This is Hattie McDaniel playing a character whose name is Mammy in the film Gone with the Wind. She ultimately becomes the first Black person to win an Academy Award playing this character. She wins for Best Supporting Actress. And again, this is in 1939. We also have a character that's called the Tragic Mulatto. Okay? And mulatto is a derogatory name for a character of biracial ethnicity. And here, this character in films, when they appear, they're likable, and they're sympathetic. And that's because they have white blood in them, but at the same time, they're confused about their ethnicity, so they're tragic. So therefore, we see these characters, they're always sad. They want to pass and be white, but they can't because they have black blood in them. And this character functions as a warning against interracial relationships, saying we don't do that. We don't mix races, because if we do, we will have these tragic children who don't know where they belong in the world. So in that way, this character functioned as a warning. This actor that you see here, her name is Freddie Washington. She performed the tragic mulatto character in a film called Imitation of Life. She actually was a biracial character. In cinema, what you learn is that sometimes they would have white actors play biracial characters, but she actually was biracial and a fantastic actor. However, Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with her because she was actually a black woman who could pass for white. They didn't know what to do with her, so her career never really took off after the film Imitation of Life, which came out in 1934. But she is wonderful, and we do have to give her due, even though she was forced to play this tragic character. In addition, there's also a character called the Buck. This character is violent, oversexed, and savage, and they want nothing more than to wreak havoc. They also pose a threat to white women because they want to sexually assault him. At least that's what film would have you think. This image of the Buck is probably the most overt representation that we've ever seen in the cinema. It's played by a white actor named Walter Long, and he's in a very unconvincing blackface playing a character named Gus in D.W. Griffith's pro-Ku Klux Klan film, The Birth of a Nation. And again, this is egregious. And if you think about all of these characters together, if we meditate on what these images are telling us about Blackness, what we come to learn is that they were saying that we were violent, we were lazy, we were dangerous, we were oversexed, we were savage, we were unintelligent, all stereotypes that we continue to hear about Black people today, which is important, right? And this is why we need to continue meditating on Blackness and think about the ways in which what we see on cinema screens and on television is more than just entertainment. And it's interesting to note, though, when we start talking about all of these characters, this is more than just about live action films. And I want to demonstrate this by showing you a clip. And these images are probably going to be disturbing to some of you, but it's from a film called Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat. And I want you to sit back and for about a minute and a half, I want you to meditate on Blackness that you see in this cartoon with me.
Listen, Mammy, there ain't no way to wash clothes. What you all need is rhythm.
What do you all mean, rhythm?
I'll show you what I mean. In Harlem, there's a little place where everyone goes to see the way a washerwoman washes her clothes.
If you like boogie woogie rhythm, she's got a beat. Let the boogie woogie washerwoman give you a treat. On every afternoon, that's when the sessions begin. And all the boys from all the bands come down and sit in. They sit around and knock each other out when they play. While the boogie woogie washerwoman washes all day. Rub me up, dub. That's just the way she rubs. Rub me up, dub. That's just the way she scrubs. Rub me up, dub. She wears out all the dust. She rubs and rubs and knuckles right on down to the nub. Rub me up, dub. That's how she kicks it off. Rub me up, dub. She keeps the notches off. Rub me up, dub. Till someone hollers off. Rub me, mama, with the boogie beat. You really ought to visit there if you've never been. It doesn't cost a penny, just come down and walk in. If you like boogie woogie rhythm, you'll get a treat. Let the boogie woogie washerwoman give you a beat.
Rub me up, dub. Rub me up, dub.
Rubbly up dub. She rubbed and rubbed the knuckles right on down to the nub, yeah.
So here, what we have then, and I hope you all can see this okay, is these images of Blackness. And I ask you to meditate on them with me, because if you look at them, you can see that Blacks are depicted as grotesque, look kind of like animals, and they're shucking and jiving. Of course, naturally gifted entertainers, another stereotype that's associated with Black folks. They just love to sing and dance. And all of this was played off for laughs. Black people are funny. We're to be laughed at. We're like animals, right? And if you meditate on Blackness and you look at these images, my question becomes, how could you ever look at this and say, it's just entertainment? There's always more going on in our film and media. And this is why we have to meditate on Blackness. But it's important to note that it's not just about images like this that denigrated Blackness. This can also be about uplift as well. And when I talk about uplift, what I mean is some characters who stood up and were trailblazers, pioneering actors in Hollywood who paved the way for the people that we see in film and television today. For example, I'm talking about people like Paul Robeson, who attended Rutgers University, who is a collegiate football All-American, who is a classically trained opera singer, and demanded that if I appear in your movies, you treat me like a man, Hollywood film producers. In addition, I'm talking about people like Hazel Scott, who was a classically trained pianist and said, you will not make me a maid in films. I will not be your mammy. I will appear in your film as myself playing the piano. And so she did. She never played a character and refused to play a maid. That was dignity. I'm talking about people like Dorothy Dandridge, who became the first Black woman to receive an Academy Award nomination in the Best Lead Acting category for her role in Carmen Jones. And then I'm also talking about the incomparable Sidney Poitier, who became the first Black man to receive an Academy Award in the Best Leading Actor category for his role in Lilies of the Field. And Sidney Poitier began his ascension to motion picture stardom in the 1950s. And by the 1960s, he was the biggest movie star in the world, regardless of ethnicity. So there's uplift here too. And the efforts of all of these actors, right, led to the development, or excuse me, the emergence of some pretty bad cats in the 1970s, right? And you might say, well, what are you talking about, bad cats? What do you mean? I mean characters like we had never seen in cinema prior until the 1970s. People like Shaft, right? People like Ron O'Neal in the movie Superfly. People like Pam Grier, who starred in Fox and Brown. And then former model turned actress Tamara Dobson and Cleopatra Jones. They appeared in a slate of films that came out in the 1970s called Blaxploitation or Blaxploitation Cinema. And these were some bad characters. You might say, well, how bad? Well, let's take another look at a little clip. And I just want to show you the opening scene from Shaft. Okay. Now I ask you to just think about what it is that you've seen here. And some of you might go, well, he's showing us a scene. Well, nothing really happens. He's just walking. And that's my point exactly. When we meditate on this image, we notice that this is some 30 years after the Scrub Me Mama with a Boogie Beat song. So we've evolved in motion pictures. We've gone from being treated inhumanely And thanks to the efforts of like those actors that I mentioned, we are now seeing this person being humanized. So in 1971, you have to understand this is groundbreaking stuff. We had not seen a Black character like this. So we have Richard Roundtree here as the star of Shaft. He comes out of that subway looking as handsome as he can. He's dressed to the nines, and then he walks through the streets of New York City owning it. He's unapologetic in his Blackness. He hadn't seen this in films before. The other thing is, you notice the sound of the film. Prior to the emergence of Blaxploitation cinema, films didn't really use rhythm and blues music, but here you hear that iconic Isaac Hayes theme from Shaft song playing here. And it's important to note that Isaac Hayes wins an Academy Award for composing that song for the theme for Shaft. So again, while we can look at this and say, well, nothing happens, there's actually a lot that is happening here. Shaft is ultimately labeled by one reviewer of the film as the first free Black man on cinema screens. So that's why it's important that we understand our histories. And again, we continue to meditate on Blackness. However, the interesting thing about it is when I started my journey studying cinema and trying to figure out the ways in which Blacks have been historically represented in film, I came to find pretty quickly that no one was talking about Blaxploitation cinema. They were talking about Sidney Poitier, and they were talking about those caricatures that Bogle had listed and outlined for us, but no one was talking about these films. And my goal then became to start salvaging and uplifting overlooked texts so that I could give Black performers and directors their due, because I think we should be talking about Blaxploitation cinema more. So I came up with a definition of the films. And so when I talk about Blaxploitation, I talk about it in terms of it being a movement. And these are films made between 1970 and 1975 by both Black and white filmmakers alike to capitalize on the Black film-going audience. So it lasts for 5 years. And if you saw a Blaxploitation film, I wanted people to be very clear that there were characteristics associated with these movies as well. So first and foremost, in order to have a Blaxploitation film, you have to have a Black hero. You don't have that, then you don't have a Blaxploitation film. In addition, these films feature more Black supporting characters. So gone are the days of tokenizing Black people where they're the only ones in the film in a group of whites. In addition, these movies are set in a predominantly Black urban space. Okay? So for the first time in Hollywood cinema, we're seeing communities like Harlem and Watts being featured on film. These movies oftentimes also feature a white villain. Now we have to understand that the white villain is a metaphor for US racial discrimination. And therefore, when the Black hero overcomes that villain, they're ultimately metaphorically defeating racism as it exists in the United States. In addition, these films feature a lot of violence. Oftentimes that's going to be levied at the white villain from the Black hero. There are also displays of Black sexuality. And for years in motion picture history, you have to understand that Blacks were figuratively castrated. We didn't explore Black sexuality, but in these films, we get to see that. And that's a major milestone in terms of Black cinematic representation. And then finally, these films feature funky R&B soundtracks, and they make that music a normal part of Hollywood cinema, regardless of who the film stars. So again, this becomes what I kind of give to the cinema world and fans of Blaxploitation more broadly, a framework through which to view these films so that we understand exactly what we're talking about when we say Blaxploitation cinema. This is part of what I do. This is part of meditating on Blackness and filling in gaps, because as we come to learn in terms of cinema history, stories about Black experiences have been suppressed, much like they have in standard K through 12 education. So I'm working to fill in the gaps in terms of cinema history. But it's also important to note that I do more than just talk about historic texts and try to salvage things and uplift them. I also talk about contemporary text. And it's great that we stop here in the 1970s in terms of cinema, because it provides a nice segue for me to talk about television. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 70s television a little bit, and then give you a little context of the 1980s to get to a contemporary show to give you a kind of an example of the ways in which I meditate on Blackness in a present day context. So in order to talk about this, we have to understand, so I'm telling you that we have Blaxploitation cinema and these films were more progressive. And to be clear, I don't say that Blaxploitation films are any better or worse than other films. They're just different in that they feature Black folks. Certainly they're imperfect. So I want to be very clear about that. I'm just trying to give them their due. But at the time when Blaxploitation emerges, it's important to note that television was also going through this kind of renaissance or very progressive period as well. And in particular, That's because of a producer called Norman Lear. Norman Lear produced sitcoms, and he produced sitcoms that were different from those that existed prior to the 1970s. So these are much different than, say, Leave It to Beaver or the Andy Griffith Show that I mentioned early on. So he produced shows like Maude, All in the Family, Good Times, and The Jeffersons. And the thing that made these sitcoms so different is that they incorporated critiques of things like politics, racism, sexism, abortion, school desegregation, so on and so forth, things like that within the storylines of comedies. We had never really seen that before. So they're very progressive shows in that they acknowledge the things that were ultimately plaguing contemporary US society. So, and Good Times and The Jeffersons, is important to note, are part of those meditations on Blackness, is that they feature Black families. So therefore, they were also groundbreaking at the times in which they came out, because there really hadn't been many sitcoms focusing on Black folks. However, as we start to move out of the decade, out of the 1970s, things start to change a little bit under the leadership of then President Jimmy Carter. Importantly, like, the US starts to become a bit more conservative under his leadership, and then conservatism takes full grasp under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan. And Reagan did a number of things that ultimately hurt Black folks and other people of color and poor folks in any number of ways. In particular, when we talk about the Reagan era and what he did, Reaganism was built on policies with covertly racist and classist implications, such as dismantling the welfare state, curbing an intrusive government, and stimulating corporate growth through unrestrained market forces. In addition, Reagan also overtly villainized people of color and the poor. For example, he said that Blacks and members of the Latinx community were welfare cheats. He blamed them for rising crime rates or alleged rising crime rates, and for heightened numbers of teenage pregnancy. So he villainized people of color. In addition, he froze the minimum wage at $3.35 an hour, cut the budgets for public housing and Section 8 rent subsidies in half, and he eliminated anti-poverty programs, and he did so all under this phrase in a way, or did so in a way that he said it was going to, quote, let America be America again, unquote. So we have this situation where the president of the United States is villainizing poor people and then at the same time taking measures to make sure that they can't lift themselves up out of poverty. This is Reaganism in a nutshell. And it had a tremendous impact on communities of color and poor people as well. Now, I go through this to say, because we get this context, I always want to provide historical context in my research. And I go through this because we have to understand that during this era, this had a tremendous impact, rather, on the televisual landscape as well. We move away from those progressive Lear comedies to more conservative television. And it's during this time that we get this really paternalistic conservative strategy that's used when putting Black people on TV. And what I mean is, it is a strategy that is called, we're gonna frame Black folks in white existences, because boy, are they much more interesting when they are around white folks. Now, we see this first beginning in 1978 and on through the 80s on a show called Diff'rent Strokes. Okay? If you don't know Diff'rent Strokes or you're unfamiliar with it, it stars Conrad Bain. His name is Philip Drummond, and he's a rich white millionaire, and he used to have a Black maid. And he told her that if anything ever happened to her, that he would take care of her boys. Well, he's true to his word. She dies an untimely death, and he goes and he relocates them from Harlem to his swanky high-rise apartment on Park Avenue. And from there, hijinks ensue on the series. The show, though, is interesting because initially, early on, it kind of talked a little bit about race and that people would be stunned to learn that Philip Drummond, this white man, had 2 Black boys. But as we move into the conservative ages, again, think about that historical context, the show becomes conservative and starts focusing on more universalized themes, things like dating and sibling rivalry. And then every now and then, it would mix in this occasional, a very special episode during which they might tackle something like the dangers of hitchhiking and child molestation. This show becomes very popular, and as you can see, it runs for about 8 years. In addition, we also see the frame Blacks and white existences formula on another show that comes out in the 80s called Webster. This runs from 1983 to 1989. It's developed for little Emmanuel Lewis, who you see here standing in the middle. He was a child star, and the setup is very similar to Diff'rent Strokes. In particular, little Webster has to go live with his white godparents, George and Karen Papadopoulos, after his parents die in a car crash. He goes to live with them, and this show is even in some ways more conservative than Diff'rent Strokes, and that it too focuses on universalized themes. Things like Webster's attempts to make the football team, or the importance of friendship, how difficult it is to parent. And it also followed the Diff'rent Strokes model to the letter, so much so that it also mixed in its own very special episodes. And it had one focusing on the dangers of playing with matches and another focusing on, you guessed it, child molestation. So it's a near clone of Diff'rent Strokes in that we have, again, another Black youth being framed in white existences. Now, this becomes critically important because as we move forward, you'll remember I started this foray talking about the 1970s comedy and then the 1980s, because I say I also talk about contemporary issues or cinema, or TV programs as well. Well, we flash forward to 29 years and 32 years respectively after Diff'rent Strokes and Webster went off the air, and NBC was quite literally at it again, albeit in a dramatic context. Here we have a promo for This Is Us, NBC's series, in which we have a Black man or a Black child once again framed in a white existence. Now, to be fair, I'm going to move forward to the promos that you typically see, even though I got to go back and show you all again. Look at the similarities here, and then here we are. And this is the promo that you typically see, or the kinds of promos you see with the adults on This Is Us. Now, I'm sure that there are some people here in the room who probably watch and love This Is Us, and I want to be very clear and say, please understand, I'm not telling you not to watch this show. This is not about saying that you're a bad person if you watch This Is Us. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to provide you with a framework to either reconsider This Is Us if you watch it, or to look at it through if you've never watched it and decide that you want to go take a look at it after this presentation. It's also important to note that here, as I do this presentation, I'm only talking about the first season of This Is Us. I know that the show is now in its 5th season, and one of the things that happens when I talk about this series is people who love it say, but yeah, in season 3, this or that. I'm talking about the first season. And again, we can take this foundational season and we can apply it to the remainder of this, to the other seasons rather, that have come out since this time. So This Is Us. And part of me feels like I should apologize if you like this show for what I'm about to do to this thing, but I don't know that I mean it, so I'm not going to do that. But in all seriousness, let's talk a little bit about This Is Us. If you're not familiar with the show, the context in which it emerges first and foremost is eerily similar to the context in which Webster and Diff'rent Strokes emerged. Importantly, this show comes out as former President Barack Obama is leaving the White House. And what we had seen at this point in time was on the campaign trail, Donald Trump, the person who would ultimately assume the presidency, had denigrated members of the Latinx community. He had villainized Muslims, denigrated women, and talked about Black folks as if they were a monolith, all under an eerily similar slogan, Make America Great Again. So the context is eerily similar. If you're unfamiliar with the context of the show or the content, the show chronicles the Pearson family, that is Jack, the ruggedly handsome and uber devoted father, Rebecca, the equally attractive and devoted mother, and then their 3 triplets, Kevin, Kate, and Randall. We get glimpses into their lives in the present day, and we also learn about them through flashbacks on this show. And so we learn things like we see how Jack and Rebecca met. We learn about their decision to have a baby, their shock when they learn that they're ultimately going to have triplets, how sad they are when they lose one of those triplets in childbirth. And then we learn about their decision to adopt another child who was abandoned at the hospital on the same day that their twins were born. And that's where a lot of the drama on This Is Us comes from. For the baby that they decide to adopt because they're determined to raise 3 children is Black and they're white. So again, we kind of see this retread where we're going to frame a Black existence in a white family. This Is Us then delves into similar tropes and brings on other tropes that we don't necessarily see in Diff'rent Strokes and Webster here as we take this foray or this journey into the Pearson family's existence. For example, let's talk some about Randall. Randall Pearson is 2 times as good as everybody else when we meet him. And it's almost as if he has to be. We meet Randall, we learn that he's very intelligent. In fact, in flashbacks, we learn as a child that he's actually a gifted student. Right? He works as a weather commodities trader in New York City, and he lives with his beautiful family in a very upscale neighborhood, and he has made it. And here we have a picture of Randall and his family. And this is all interesting because, again, I don't want to downplay the significance of having a Black man on television who is so well-rounded and so significant. Again, this is not to take away from him, but it's saying that somehow instead, that in order for Randall to exist in this world, he somehow seemed to have to be twice as good just so that he could fit in, right? And if we compare him to his brother, Kevin is an actor, but he doesn't even really know if he's a very good actor. He questions his own talent. So maybe he's made it in spite of his ability to act and not as a result of it. We compare Randall to his sister, Kate. She's just Kevin's manager, so she hasn't really gone out and found a great career herself. And so he seems to be twice as good as everybody else, as if he has to be. And we know that that is something that we say about Black folks and other people of color all the time. In order to be successful, you have to be twice as good, right? And in essence here, Randall is twice as good seemingly just so he can fit or be framed in this white existence. When we first meet Randall, and we look at this image of him with his beautiful wife and his beautiful little girls, we can see that he has it all. But at the same time, there's one thing that's missing from this character. He yearns to know his biological father, whom he eventually tracks down with the help of a private detective. And his father's name is William. He meets William, they hit it off instantly, and Randall moves him in with he and his family so that they can bond. While they are there, William recounts the story of how he came to abandon Randall. In recounting that story, we meet William, we see it in flashbacks rather. He is a aspiring 20-something musician and writer who one day meets a young woman named Laurel while riding a city bus. The two quickly fall in love, and then they become doubly irresponsible. One, they get hooked on drugs, and two, they end up having a baby. Now, it's important to note, right, that during this time, this is all set in the 1980s. So therefore, we have these two Black people who ultimately fit to a T the description of what Ronald Reagan was saying about Black people in the 1980s. You're going to be careless, you're going to get babies that you can't take care of, you're hooked on drugs, and therefore in that way, This Is Us ultimately upholds Reagan era conservative ideologies that are racist about Black people, right? As this show moves on, we also learn that Randall's mother passes away during childbirth and William can't take care of him again, just as Ronald Reagan said Black people would not be able to do. They can't take care of their children. So he is the embodiment of problematic 80s discourses. As a result, he takes William and he leaves him at a fire station, knowing that he is hooked on drugs and he can't take care of him. But have no fear, because we have some white saviors who can take care of Randall. And This Is Us, not only we don't get not just one, not two, we get 4 white saviors to take care of little baby Randall. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of white saviors, these characters, we kind of transition or use the definition that's used in film. They're messianic characters who, after encountering challenging circumstances, learn valuable lessons about themselves and their culture as they work to rescue members of other racial groups from terrible fates. Moving on, quote, white lead characters or a white lead character gets credit for vastly improving their life, theirs being the person of color, thus diminishing the autonomy and jurisdiction of the person of color. So again, we see this trope in NBC's This Is Us. First, we get the white savior in the form of Joe the fireman, who is the character who finds Randall abandoned outside of his fire station. Now, it's really interesting because when Joe finds the baby, his initial action is to take the baby to his house. Joe is in a tumultuous marriage and he goes there and he tells his wife he believes baby Randall a gift from God and that they should raise the child. His wife wants no parts of it. So Joe takes the baby to make sure it's safe to the hospital, right? There we meet Dr. Katowski, who is in his own difficult circumstance. While Joe is in a tumultuous marriage, Dr. Katowski has unfortunately lost his wife. It's been a year since her death, but he's been unable to fully move on from her, and kind of move beyond his grief. So there he's struggling. Dr. Katowski happens to be Jack and Rebecca's doctor, and he is the one who has to inform them that their third child passed away in child labor, and certainly that is tragic, and we do not make light of that, right? And he tells them that their child passed away, and he talks to Jack about when life gives you lemons, making lemonade. That uplifts Jack's spirits a little bit, though he is feeling down, and seeing how strong Jack is in the moment kind of gets Dr. Katowski to say, I'm going to recommit to my life, right? At this point, Jack and Rebecca, the third and fourth white savior, decide they're going to take baby Randall home. And it's interesting because, again, they're dedicated to raising children. And even though they take him home, one of the things that they don't seem to notice is the fact that little baby Randall is actually Black. They don't think about it. And in this way, This Is Us perpetuates post-racial or colorblind discourses. Essentially, post-racialism and colorblindness purports that the US has moved beyond racism, something that we know, if you're paying any attention in a 2021 context, we know is not true, right? When you look at the Capitol riot and see people up there carrying Confederate flags, that tells you something about where we are in terms of racism here in this country. And ultimately, we have to understand that there's a danger in post-racial discourses, as anti-racist activist and scholar Tim Weiss tells us, or problematizes. He says that colorblind ideology actually discourages discussions of racism, even ignores them, and as such makes it more difficult to challenge racial biases and discrimination. Therefore, we have to understand that a show like This Is Us, by perpetuating these colorblind discourses, they do so to uphold white virtue, meaning that the characters just kind of look around at each other like, what is this thing called racism? And when did this become a thing? Because they don't seem to care about it. They're colorblind. They just love people. The impact of that is that when something does happen that pertains to race in the narrative, they just get to stand around looking like awestruck victims of sorts, even though we know that racism is real and alive and well. It's also interesting to note then when we talk about meditating on Blackness, that Blackness is depicted opposite the way that whiteness is. This show is very much about white virtue, but ultimately, just like on Diff'rent Strokes and Webster, we see an evil Black threat come to the family on This Is Us, and the evil Black threat kind of disrupts white heteronormativity, excuse me. So on Webster, on Diff'rent Strokes, for example, we see it in the form of Reggie Jackson, when Willis, one of the Drummond boys, decides that he wants to use Reggie Jackson as a stand-in for his father instead of Mr. Drummond, so that he can win a father and son contest and beat his braggadocious friend. We see Reggie Jackson show up and he's fit. We see him here with the weights, and compared to Mr. Drummond is scrawny, and he knows that Reggie Jackson is Black, just like Willis, and therefore he's a little fearful that he's going to lose his son. This is ultimately played for laughs, but still there are racial implications to Reggie Jackson's presence here, disrupting white heteronormativity. In addition, we see it on Webster when Katherine, one of her friends named Dr. Franklin, visits. Now, Dr. Franklin is an accomplished woman. She has a PhD in sociology, she has 3 kids of her own, and she specializes in placing youth of color in good homes. Dr. Franklin represents the threat because she outright tells Katherine that I don't think white folks should raise Black children. Again, Katherine then says, well, I kind of thought about it in passing, but boy, I just thought we were going to be okay. I thought it would be fine. So we have this evil Black threat then coming to intervene or disrupt rather the Papadopoulos family. We also see it on This Is Us. We have the evil Black threat in the form of a woman named Yvette. And I'm going to show you a clip here from an episode called The Pool. This chronicles the Pearsons when they go to a public pool on an especially hot day. And the clip I'm going to show you is one in which Randall has wandered off from the rest of the family, and Rebecca is going to be looking for him. So I'll play this now.
Randall? Randall? Randall, hello? Did you not hear me calling you? Hey, what are you doing over here?
Oh, no. It's okay. I'm watching him.
It's fine. I have him now. I'm sorry. I'm his mother. I was a little panicked. I'm Rebecca.
We know who you are.
You do?
Oh, yes. When a white family has a Black child and they don't introduce themselves to any of us, we tend to take notice.
Well, thank you for watching him. He's just not supposed to be over here. Not over here like that. There's nothing wrong with over here. I just mean that I want him where we can see him, where we're sitting in front of us. Thank you. It was very nice to meet you. Randall, come on. Let's go. Come on. Thank you. Actually, you stay right here. That's my son, and I'm his mother. And I don't know if you have some sort of problem with that arrangement, but also I don't really care. Thank you very much for watching my son, but I have him now.
Okay.
Okay.
You need to get the child a proper haircut. The razor bumps on his neck. You need a barber who knows how to cut Black hair.
Come on. Hey, I told you to stay with your brother, didn't I?
Sorry.
Okay, now I have to say, I think this is one of the most ridiculous scenes I've ever seen in any television show. There are a couple of things going on here. First and foremost, there is apparently some unspoken rule that if you were white and you adopt a black child, you got to go and introduce yourself to all the black people in your neighborhood. Now, I am not discounting the value and the importance of if you were white raising a black child, that you should teach your child about their history, culture, and identity and have them around people who look like them. That is important. But the way it's presented here, it's like it's some kind of obligation that Rebecca and Jack didn't know that they were supposed to live up to. In addition, apparently, if you don't go and introduce yourself to all the black people who live in your neighborhood, they're going to sit around obsessing and talking about you because their primary concern is taking care of your child. So again, the evil black threat kind of disrupting white heteronormativity, and then it's perpetuating these other fallacies about race as we look at This Is Us. As we move forward, I have to say though, Rebecca does have a change of heart here and realizes that maybe I do need some help. And so she goes and she makes friends with Yvette. She apologizes for exercising her white authority to check her and tell her that she is actually Randall's mother. And then the two get to be friends. And at this point, Yvette morphs from being or transitions from being the evil black threat, and she goes to become the magical African-American friend. If you're unfamiliar with this, this is again another trope that appears in cinema. And these are mysterious black characters who possess great wisdom or mystical powers, which they use to assist white protagonists. Moving on, there's a scholar, or excuse me, a writer named by the last name of Farley who talks about this. And he says, blacks are depicted as the all-seeing, wise characters because the screenwriters, read white Hollywood, who created them are fundamentally ignorant about African-American life and culture. He summarizes then that instead of getting backstories or histories, magical African-American friends, they get mystical powers. Now, this certainly can be applied to Yvette. Let's think about this here in the context of this show, this first season. We don't know anything about Yvette. We don't know if she is married. We don't know if she works. We don't know how many kids she has. But what we do know is she has infinite black wisdom that she can pass along to Jack and Rebecca. And that becomes her function in this first series on the 3 episodes in which, this first season in the 3 episodes in which she appears. First, she talks about telling Rebecca about getting Randall his hair cut at a proper barber. She then tells Jack that he should take his son, enroll Randall in a gifted school. And then finally, she connects him with a martial arts school run by black men so Randall can be around people who look like him. Aside from that, we know nothing about Rebecca. And this is in great contradiction to Fireman Joe, who appears in just 2 episodes, but he gets a backstory. We learn about his tumultuous marriage and that he and his wife are ultimately going to be back together. So here again, we see also that This Is Us perpetuates the problematic trope of the magical African-American friend. So I just want to summarize this. I know that I'm just at about time here very quickly by reading a quote about Webster and Diff'rent Strokes that I think we can also apply to This Is Us. In particular, Robin R. Means Coleman summarized those 2 shows by saying, quote, white men became surrogate fathers to African-American children, thereby saving black youth from their backgrounds, which was the ghetto, from their roots, an absentee and or inadequate black family and community, and from their blackness, cultural differences viewed as outside the norm. I think if we look at that, we can substitute This Is Us and say the same thing happens on that series. And therefore, as a result of this, like I said, I wanted to offer you this framework and ask you to meditate on blackness with me to demonstrate to you that we always have to look at media and film as a part of the struggle, and we have to be committed to getting representational equity as well. If we are not, and we can continue to do things and say like, it's just entertainment, then we do a disservice for those who are out there in Hollywood grinding and trying to make inroads so that things can be better. And as a result of that, it is key and it is very important that we all continue to take our entertainment seriously, enjoy it, but as we do so, we must meditate on blackness. Thank you.
Wow. I'm sure everyone is saying, wow. Dr. Lawrence, we appreciate your time and your presentation today. So grateful for the knowledge that you dropped. And I'm sure that we're going to be processing for a while. So thank you again. We appreciate it. We have time for a couple of questions. So drop them in your chat real quick before we transition into our self-care session. We do have one It says, are there any crossover studies or work that you have done with media psychology? Maybe pairing media depictions of social aggression and violence with race?
Actually, I haven't. I think that would be great. If you are a faculty member and are thinking collaboration, let's talk.
Awesome. Don't see any other questions, but a whole lot of incredible, thank you, wow, you're awesome. We appreciate it. Anyone else who has any comments, feel free to follow up with Dr. Lawrence. We'll see you at self-care session to end our day so we can rejuvenate ourselves for our big day tomorrow. So thank you, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you all. I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
All right, signing off.
Bye, Joelle. Thank you for everything.